let me start by, let me also introduce myself. I'm Ale Abdo. I'm from Brazil, where I'm in right now. I currently work at Gustave Eiffel University in France. But thanks to vacations and COVID and remote work, I'm here in Brazil right now. In Brazil, I've been part of the, let's say, hackerspace movement, and I helped organize one of the early hackerspaces here in Brazil. But in France, I also work in the Science, Technology and Society department, laboratory in the university, studying, among other things, how these movements are developing and institutionalize, not necessarily institutionalizing, but how they're interacting with institutions, and among other things, parts of them are institutionalizing and participating in this institutionalization of open source in diverse areas of scientific research. Yeah, so I was also the organizer of some open science conferences in Brazil. Like 10 years ago, we started organizing some open science conferences to discuss open science, and so yeah, that kind of line of work / transformative innovation in academia.
Okay, I will introduce myself. I am Julieta Arancio. I tend to say I have many hats. Right now, my main hat is as a social science researcher. I'm originally from Argentina, where I am not right now, different to Ale. I'm based in the UK. I work at the University of Bath. And what I do in this hat is I do a case study of open hardware for science. So I study how scientists, physicists at University of Bath are building a microscope that is open source and that is fully 3D printed. How this could be an example of transformations in academia because of how it disrupts the current politics of patents and career progression for scientists and stuff like that, and how it enables new research questions to emerge. So that's my main hat. Other hats are more activist, let's say. I'm a co-organizer of GOSH, which is one of the communities we will be talking about today, which is the Gathering for Open Science Hardware. You will see the logo there. I co-founded the Latin American GOSH, and I'm also part of an educational program for people making open hardware who usually are a bit lost about why are we doing this in academia, no one supports them. And we provide mentorship and best practices and connect them to a community so they feel more welcome and they can develop their work better. So that's me. And maybe we can tell Ale why we're here through the same presentation. Like the presentation itself, I think, tells why we are here.
Does anybody else? Would anybody else like to introduce themselves, or did everybody? Well, Karen already. Well, yeah. Karen told us about her husband, but not very much about herself.
And she works in food and agriculture.
And food agriculture, yeah. Okay, so Carlos is going to stay as an observer, he said, right?
Yeah.
Well, you're welcome to change your mind, Carlos, if you find this. All right, so time to open the tools of research. We've already introduced ourselves as individuals. What about this movement for open hardware for science? So it's not as new as one would imagine. Of course, like, it comes together with the open source movement, but there's already obviously a tradition of publishing research designs in science, and the thing is instrument design for research instruments in science The thing is, as designs became more complicated and specialized, and there's been also a lot of for many things, the main and also standardized and commodified, they've been turned into a more kind of a commodity thing where you just buy ready-made equipment. And as universities got more money, also I guess that also participated in it. But anyway, we're not going to explain why the history of scientific instruments here. But the thing is, right now there's a situation where a lot of scientific instruments are very expensive, and their usage is restricted to those who can pay, and the ability to modify them to specific purposes in science is quite restricted by the way they're designed, by patents, by other things. And so there's been a reaction to that, that in a way, like the open source software movement goes back to the idea that, well, at a point in time, we were sharing things and we were able to cooperate more freely, and what we should be doing that in science. There's a lot of reasons why that's important and positive for science. So since the mid-90s or early 2000s, this movement for open hardware in science is growing. So do I switch the slides, Julieta?
Yes.
And just to give some examples of what does it mean in very concrete terms. So you have like here audio moth. So maybe you've heard of Arduinos and small microcontrollers. So there's been this portable embedded small chip microchips that you can buy very cheaply and that are able to control sensors and activate other equipment programmatically. So this is just a very simple machine to record the environment, the acoustic environment it's a UK-based company, but it's deployed. Julieta, remind me, it's deployed in Latin America. Right?
Yeah, it is. It is a very simple device the company is called Open Acoustic Devices. It's a spin-off of a researcher in the UK, but now it's so popular because it's so low cost and allows conservation ecologists to do much more powerful research that non-profits all around the world are using it.
Right. So you can record the acoustic environment in a forest or in a different, and you can program it to record in specific times or things like that. So it's something that could be available. Maybe there was something available before, but this one you can configure and it's very cheap and you can reproduce it. Same thing here with OpenFlexter. It's the one that Julieta is studying, whose development Julieta is studying at the University of Bath. So it's a microscope that is being developed together with a makerspace in Tanzania, but also with the University of Bath, physicists at the University of Bath and a makerspace in Tanzania. And its goal is also to enable diagnostics, right, Julieta?
Yeah, for malaria. So OpenFlexure is originally again from the UK, but it has been not only reproduced but forked, meaning that people take it and adapt it to their needs. And it's now used in Peru. It's been used in every continent. There was a highlight that was achieved not so long ago. In Tanzania, they use it for detecting malaria in a sustainable way. They don't have to buy microscopes; they just print the microscopes. And
great.
Our last one.
Our last example is the Gorgas tracker, which is this one produced by an innovation lab in Peru.
it's basically a GPS, but has lots of features that are very useful for the epidemiology researchers. They were trying to understand, again, how malaria moves with people in the Peruvian Amazon, in indigenous communities. And the tools that you usually need to use for that are proprietary, they are imported, they are very expensive. And funny part or not is that they are not designed for the Amazon weather conditions, so they don't work. So they had to design this new equipment, and yeah, with a sample of, they produced 70 of those, and with the study they produced, they had an impact in policy, and now health policy in Peru has changed because of that study, which was pretty impressive.
So there's, on top of those, there's a lot of other examples. This is some that we think are interesting, but we could mention like from lab equipment, also to wetware, to like access to reagents and to lab material that is not necessarily would not necessarily fit the category of instruments, but having the right reagents, having the right raw material, the right input materials for experiments, and also having the material, having the tools to design new scientific tools. So in Brazil, there is another example, which is was developed in the south of Brazil by a group that is also connected to GOSH and to the Latin American GOSH that Judith helped start as well. That they developed a tool to produce circuit boards, which usually are not so easy to work with. So you can build the machine that builds other machines. So we already talked about like the importance of having the tools for research, customizable tools, and to allow for a lot of scientists to collaborate and reproduce the results. Also, like more reproducible results is also a big argument for open science hardware. And for this reason, a lot of people got together. A lot of people that were involved in this movement, or they were practicing, wasn't maybe not. They were practicing this kind of approach in science. They were connected through many different initiatives, and then something more globally structured was proposed, which is the Gathering for Open Science Hardware, which unlike other global organizations that work on open hardware, is specifically devoted for open science hardware. So because science is it can be seen as a specific field with specific needs, like the very fact that it has these requirements of reproducibility, collaboration, that science in a sense is a global commons of knowledge. So it has a lot of specific reasons that open hardware in science deserves like a more speedy and concerted effort.
And yeah, that's also to differentiate from the open hardware community. No, it's like a subfield of the open hardware community. Then if you probably saw all the projects that people work on with Arduino, with 3D printing. Usually they are maker spaces. They are like, some of them are social innovation, some of them are consumer products, but as Ale was mentioning, science has very, very particular requirements. So this is why GOSH is there.
So it's like the overlap of open hardware and open science hardware.
Perfect.
This kind of so well, this GOSH has gathered in several online and in-person discussions and meetings, but at a certain point the issue is raised. Okay, we need to tackle the issue of policy because that's very much especially in academia, incentives and the resources are very policy guided. And there's even more intentional policy today than there was before. I mean, yes, it is kind of one of the themes of this conference also. So infrastructure in science and institutions are really like a critical issue. And also because hardware is that's a phrase I coined, like, it's kind of silly, but hardware is hard. If you compare to open source software, where you can just stay in your room and code for days and then publish something, and then somebody else finds it in another office and does some hacking on their couch or in their bed or in their office or wherever they want, in the park. Hardware is not the same thing. You need money to build it. You need the material bases that costs money to build the tools. You need to have very specific documentation. You need tools to work on the tools. So like in software, you have something that's called the compiler, which helps you turn code into something the machines will work with. And in hardware, you need like other tools. You need a workbench to develop your tools. You need a 3D printer to print a thing. So you need costly physical stuff to work on, and sometimes you need safe conditions. You need specific
multiple knowledges.
Specific.
Well, you need multiple expertise also, because making hardware demands like very different layers of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. And technical knowledge of assembling things, which in software can be easily automated. A lot of things are easily automated. In hardware, you need to know like how to put things together, because you need to put things together. You don't have a magical robot that does it for you. You don't yet have a robot that does it for you. Like 3D printers advanced that a lot, and it's one of the reasons that they're so popular, that they kind of help assembling things, making things that are easily assemblable but you still have to like deal with the technical expertise of putting it together. But so the good, sorry, go ahead, Julieta, you were saying something.
No, something that I think we didn't mention is that in open hardware, what you share is the design, right? Like what we share in open source software, you share the source code. What do you share in open hardware when you are talking about an object? Well, it's the design, the schematics for the electronics, the list of materials you need to build it, the instructions for doing so, the software that powers the hardware, if that is the case. Those are the materials that are shared.
Right. You don't have to build. I mean, the building of the software is also automated, but the hardware you actually have to build it. So you only have the design. You have to translate it into something concrete in order even to work and advance and test if it's working better. So it's hard, but we're getting close. There's really a lot that has advanced, and like the examples we showed you may give you a hint. As well, for reasons of technical advances in electronics and 3D printing, all those things, but also a lot of advances in more structural, organizational, this infrastructural work, like licenses and communities, and how to have the right specifications on how to share things, and all of these things have been built through the last decade or more. So next. So in order to make sure that we're advancing it, make sure that all this work that has been done gets recognized and gets incorporated into public policy, with the GOSH community decided to prepare some recommendations to different actors. So one for academia, more really internally to technology transfer offices in universities and research institutions. One aimed at international organizations like UNESCO even the UN or maybe the World Trade Organization, if they ever want to listen to these things. And another one like for science funders and either government science funder or private science funders as well.
You want me to pick up from now?
Yeah, and the idea of this, so this is a collaborative exercise, and the motivation for the collaborative exercise is that we've built this policy recommendations in very open participatory processes with inviting people from different backgrounds. We have some documents that we believe are quite interesting, but we're now in a moment of field testing them, let's say. So I mean, we really like feedback from people who are working with the innovation policy and transitions and transformative policy in other fields, either technical or non-technical, like either directly related or not to open hardware or to science, but that can like help us understand how to make the best use of these policy recommendations, but also to tell us whether like to help us see how they fit their purpose and what things we might be improved and what other strategies we could be pursuing. So you can pick up, Julieta.
Okay. So yes, exactly. I was saying, GOSH organized earlier during one half of 2021 a series of workshops with this different, organized through audiences. The first was technology transfer offices, international organizations, and then science funders. And during these discussions, which were really interesting, and all the views there were exposed, it was very interesting to understand how people think of open science hardware. We came to a series of recommendations. So I'm gonna briefly describe the work of the more academic policy brief, which is the one aimed at technology transfer offices. Is titled "Open Hardware is Ready to Help Technology Transfer Offices Maximize the Impact of Academic Research." And this is a very specific audience, and because of course it was on purpose, because it was after many discussions within the GOSH community, in which not only people in academia participate. You have people in academia, but you have also community scientists, educators, entrepreneurs that use open science hardware. But many designs of open hardware are created in academia. And all developers of open hardware in academia were mentioning the same, as how they were facing this resistance, or not resistance, but maybe they were not supported by the university technology transfer office, who, I guess everyone knows, but if you don't know, is the organization within university that detects if your invention is patentable or not, and if it is patentable, they support you in kind of packaging your invention so businesses can adopt it and implement it outside academic work. So that talk with technology transfer offices was super interesting. And I put there, like in a series of boxes, some of the main ideas. The main idea I would say of this brief is that we are not saying that open hardware licenses should replace right now absolutely replace the paradigm of patents and IP. What we're saying is that the current model based on patenting and IP is missing opportunities for impact. And these missed opportunities for impact are twofold. One, in inventions that are marked as non-interesting by the technology transfer office, but that could be super interesting according to other criteria. These inventions could be openly licensed and people could reuse them outside the criteria of the technology transfer office and generate impact. And the other one is that many researchers are already they do want to license their work openly. So if they do want to license their work openly, usually they get no support. And that is a really missed opportunity for impact in these projects. So what we are proposing is that as an alternative, technology transfer offices diversify the portfolio of tools they have to support researchers at university. So we have, as Ali was mentioning, there is a lot of work on, by the open hardware community, there is a lot of work on creating licenses, open hardware licenses, creating even certification programs for open hardware that certify that this is open. So all these instruments, all this knowledge is ready to adopt by technology transfer offices. There is work to do in terms of how that mechanism would work inside university, but the open hardware community is also willing to support that and to work together on that. But the main idea is how much more impact the work of researchers could have if they are supported by their own universities. Right now, the situation of most open hardware developers in academia is that they do the development in their free time. Many researchers that are not in the global north even pay for themselves for materials to do the development. So it's a very precarious situation that makes projects very unsustainable. So we think this is a first step towards collaborating instead of fighting technology transfer offices inside universities. That is where the policy brief is living. I don't know if I click here, if you will be able to see it. Ale, can you tell me if you see it?
I do see it.
Okay, so the policy brief, if you want to read about that, it's in Zenodo. You can download the document. And the main ideas that I was mentioning are here, the key messages, and all the people that collaborated in this are, here. Something that I think we didn't mention about GOSH is that GOSH is very intentional about the demographics of everything it does, from the events to the workshops to the policy briefs. Everything has very strong representation from people around the world, which we think is interesting in the middle of being a technical, it's a socio-technical field, but in a technical community. Am I back to the slides? Yeah. So that is the first brief that we have. The other kind of big work that we've done was a conversation between international organizations. Ali mentioned this, but for example, UNESCO, people working at the Red Cross, all these organizations, maybe you don't know, but they are using open hardware, for example, for humanitarian aid. They have fab labs. They are producing prostheses. Is prosthesis the right word? I don't know. They are producing things in the field, and they would absolutely benefit from a more disseminated open hardware practice. So we brought together all those representatives, and we thought of how open hardware is a key for accelerating science and technology towards the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Basically because pairing open hardware and distributed production, the ability of building stuff in a decentralized way, we can increase the innovation capacity of these international organizations, but also of governments, of agencies in the global south that are in resources, in areas with low resources. And most importantly, because we see it today in open hardware, and we had a very, very good example of this during, unfortunately, the COVID pandemic. Open hardware has enabled a super important decentralized response to the pandemic, where the conventional manufacturing capacities were absolutely saturated, and therefore distributed production started producing the protection elements that people needed, supplying local communities. So that was, there are studies of that already. If you're interested, I can link to those. But that shows how openness and this paired with distributed production can enable some very, very interesting partnerships between stakeholders in industry, in civil society, in government to tackle mission-oriented challenges. Another important thing was that open hardware can enable the setting of standards that allow innovation to be more democratic and not siloed by companies that do not share information. So all in all, basically what it's saying is international organizations can accelerate the development of open hardware if they incorporate it as part of their strategies. And we see some of this. UNESCO has a very recent open science recommendation, and for the first time, open hardware is there. It's very clear that there is less work on open hardware than on open data and open publications because it's a bit vague, but we think it's a very good start. And we think if international organizations can increasingly incorporate this in their digital strategies, this could really foster open hardware development. Again, it is available there. In Zenodo, you can find everything in a community we have that is called Open Science Hardware. It's the same format, and key messages are here. And finally, GOSH organized a series of conversations with scientific funders, which are super relevant because as Ale was saying, there is a huge problem with incentives. So why would people produce open hardware? And we also see the effect, the impact that science funders have when we see the evolution of the open access movement or the open data movement, how the requirements in grants are super impactful for adoption. So this was a bit different, like the methodology was a bit different because this was not one workshop or two workshops. It was a series of conversations between science funders where we had, fortunately, lots of foundations that joined the call. And it was interesting to see how science funders value open hardware in science because of the access and control over technology that it provides. The fact Ale was mentioning to work more efficiently, to work to accelerate innovation, and that in the funders conversation, that was seen as interoperability, facilitating frictionless innovation, not duplication of efforts, avoiding duplication of efforts in science. They were also very interested in creating a full open science tool chain, not only talking about publication, not only talking about data, but how that data is generated. So providing openness since the generation of data through open instruments. And the main benefits they envisioned were open hardware can enable new research questions, new methods for doing science, and provide access to science where today doesn't exist. So some of the actions were to try to promote communities of practice that are in fact the one that are sustaining the development of open hardware, take a very careful look at diversity and inclusion in open hardware, and study further the jump from prototypes to production in open hardware, which is something that today we don't know much about. And because people who do open hardware, again, as we were saying before, you need so much knowledge in different domains. You can't know everything. So there is some support needed there to go from a good prototype to a product. So, oh, I don't know what happened there. You can access the funding salons there. That's how we call this series of conversations. So I don't know if there are any comments or questions. Why are we doing that? What does that mean? So we welcome those now. Okay, so Ale, you want to say something before we move on?
Me? No, just so we But I think you're going to do it. I was just you're going to introduce how we're going to discuss what the exercise is going to be about.
Yep.
There it is.
Okay. So the goal, Ale was mentioning before, the goal of our interest in being here was to get out of our mental box and try to observe with other eyes the work on these policy briefs, which is the change. We kind of have some idea through our activity in GOSH of which is the change we want to see, and we have some ideas of how to get there, which are some of the ideas that I just shared, but it would be great to understand how other people see that. So we were thinking of this exercise, and because it's an exercise that allows us to connect the present with a desired future or a non-desired future, and would help us identify which are the different futures that can be opened if open science hardware happens, finally. And it's quite useful to think of our own assumptions when thinking of change. So basically, if you never came across it, the model is based on the observation that change has like a life cycle, and there is like a dominant form of gaining momentum and then kind of dying. And in some areas of society, these changes can be very fast, but in other areas, they take a different kind of timing. So it's better to frame them instead of time. It's better to understand them in terms of the really important differences between these situations, between these scenarios. What it says there is red is the way things are done today. Green is the future we aspire to. And the blue is the innovation, the disruptive innovation towards a future. So the first horizon is the dominant system. It represents business as usual. It's the stable, reliable way of doing things, but the world changes. So these aspects also change. And some of these aspects may feel that they are not fit for purpose anymore. So we see what is our situation there next. The green one, H3, is like the long-term successor to that business as usual situation. And it's something that grows and introduces completely new ways of doing things and fits much better in the new world that has changed. So when we see this green here, these are kind of pockets of the future that already exist today. So these worlds coexist today. It's not that they are suddenly replaced one by another. I don't know why I'm explaining this to transformations people, but they know this better than I do. And finally, the second horizon is the pattern of transition activities and innovations, the people that are trying to do things different, responding to how the landscape is changing. So some of these innovations will be taken by the business as usual in order to prolong their life. Some of them will maybe open the way to the green future. So how do we see this today? How do we as GOSH? This was something I was thinking of, maybe Ale, we can discuss about it, is that the Horizon 1 is the situation we have today, where most people around the world are excluded from contributing to science in a way that matters to them. As Ale was mentioning, it's very difficult to access the tools for producing data. It's not the only aspect, of course, but it's a very infrastructure for science is a very, very relevant thing. And that makes that today, not even if you are in academia, but if you are away from the areas that receive more resources, you are very limited in the knowledge you can produce. H3, or the future we aspire to, is a system where anyone can contribute to the science that matters to their own community, to their own questions. That is where we would like to be in the future. And we humbly think that open science hardware can be a disruption. we think that it can be a way of unlocking some of the systems that are preventing many people from accessing to contribute to science. So the way we thought of this exercise was to ask questions and discuss with whoever wants to, to try to understand how our perspectives can be complemented with other people's perspectives. So the first question we had was, do you see open hardware is relevant for your activity, for your field of study, or not? If it's relevant, how is it relevant? I don't know, Ale, we can start with you if you want to.
So let's just take a moment to see who because now we're entering the collaborative exercise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Take a moment to see who's going to who's with us, and
okay.
And so we can turn on the cameras and like say, because the idea now is to kind of sketch and share or understanding or lack of understanding on these issues, and see if you can translate them into constructive criticism of what we've presented so far, right?
Yeah, and I am turning back to the browser so I can add comments in here.
Mm-hmm. All right, so both, well, Pip, Karen, and Carlos, if you're around, feel welcome to turn on your sound and cameras and say hi. And I may start myself, like Julieta was suggesting, talking about. So this is more like the idea was to have more like a contextualizing ourselves question. It's not the main, not only the goal of the exercise, but also so we can say a little bit how we see this fitting into what we're doing. I see you. Hello, Karen.
Hey there.
Hi.
Hi, tech guy.
Hello, tech husband.
Yeah. So I'm just yeah, I'm the tech guy. I come at this from a couple different angles. One, I have an engineering background in mechanical engineering, but I've also spent a large amount of my career in software development in different capacities as well. And so I'm quite familiar with the open source world in terms of software, and I have some exposure to the open source in a hardware realm as well.
Oh, that's cool.
And so this is it interests me, and I'm absorbing your presentation. A couple things that I could add. You know, the open source software, from my experience, what really enabled that was inexpensive access to inexpensive computing resources. Anybody with a laptop or a desktop computer could start developing software, provided they learned how to program. Same thing with hardware, conceptually at least, but it becomes there's a number of extra disciplines that become involved. If you're strictly talking about something mechanical, then you need some practical knowledge of engineering principles to design something. And if there's something, some electricity involved, then you need some understanding of that discipline as well. And it just goes on from there.
Yeah.
And you can design as to whatever your imagination can come up with. But then to manifest that into a physical reality is yet another challenge. And so you're accurate in mentioning the Arduino and 3D printing and those types of devices that enable the cost of entry to developing something to be minimized. But at some point, you need to produce that device that you've engineered, that you've designed. And so there's a challenge there to bridge in actually creating these devices for reproducibility. If you just have something very simple that you can produce on a 3D printer, then your open source realm is just that file that is used to produce the 3D output, 3D printer output. But if it's anything more complicated, then you need something more sophisticated. You may need a machine shop, or you may need other expertise that comes into it. Your example of the microscope was fascinating, because that in itself, at first glance, it looks like something fairly simple, but it's actually a very sophisticated instrument. Yeah. And it requires quite a few disciplines to produce to any sort of accuracy or to any sort of quality. And so how your biggest challenge then becomes, how do you take it from the design phase to the point where you can actually produce it in a viable fashion? And that's where your green line, your biggest part of the green line challenge is in producing something that a design as well as an environment that is actually viable.
Someone called it the valley of death. That gap, and I mean, you're absolutely right. It's one of the difficulties, but I think one of the advantages too is this need for multiple knowledges to come together. At open hardware development, if you want to take it further than the prototype stage, you're right. It's that we see that happening all the time with projects. And there is some work. Well, that's an interesting question. What do you think? This is something everyone is discussing right now. What do you think can take us there? Is it in terms of infrastructure? Is it in terms of ideas? In terms of knowledge? Because it's a different system. It's talking about distributed production more than, I think, even open hardware.
As I said, I think that the imagination, I think, is wide open. Anybody can dream of something, at least in a conceptual way, of a way of doing it better. But then the knowledge that's required to turn it into a viable design is another matter. And that requires some significant education. And it can be acquired, and you can open source that too, for that matter. You know, there's lots of access to all kinds of different media for teaching people how to do things. Social media is filled with that, and there's lots of other avenues for filling that gap. But that takes time, and that takes a number of disciplines. You know, going back to your microscope example, that requires some expertise in optics, mechanical. If it's got any electricity in it, then there's electromechanical knowledge required, and that doesn't happen overnight. You don't pick that up over the weekend on watching a few YouTube videos, and then to produce that is yet another game in itself. You need a shop or a company or a manufacturing operation that can actually produce that.
Yeah, I would say there's where your policy and finance and collaboration comes in, because I think there's a lot of energy around the world for open source and hackers, and there's a lot of people who are interested in doing that. I mean, I think if you look back 150 years, people were tinkering, you know, in putting and bricolaging things together through innovation. And so I think that there is that energy. Maybe it's the platform to bring all that together. I think there's also a new way of financing, you know, things for carbon zero, sustainable development, diversity and equity, like all of those things. There's maybe a new financing platform needed. In terms of like how people are going to have livelihoods and income from it. Not that everybody needs to make $1 billion, you know, but that we bring everybody up in terms of the financial return. So not only are things commercialized, but people make fair money in doing that. And then and I think that's where the policy comes in and the buy-in in terms of, you know, governments, business, and maybe even back to your university example, that the university buys into open source. Now, most of my work is as a practitioner, but I looked at a lot of transition work for the food system. And so when as a practitioner, when I'm out, you know, on a farm project, I'm looking at how I can use open source to build a tractor, an electric tractor. And there are plans actually for that. So, but I could also use open source to monitor, you know, insect populations, or to, you know, look at, we're organic. So the farm I'm working on currently, but organic. So it's not, we're not looking at, you know, pesticides as much, but there is the opportunity there to use open source more to track, you know, uses in orchards and things like that, or to track biodiversity, which is, you know, part of the well-being economy that we want to shift to. So I see, yeah.
That's interesting, because there is one project that, in fact, there is a community that is called GOAT, Open Agri-Tech, let's say, that they work on
gathering for open technology, open agricultural technology. It's a kind of a partner with Gosh.
It's like a Gosh partner, but many people from Gosh are there, but they work on agriculture. And I can talk about one project in particular in Argentina that is about setting up a lab for producing research on the agroecological transition, which is something, the agroecological transition is not in the official agenda. In Argentina, the official agenda is dominated by industrial agriculture. So there is knowledge that people need to understand if they are, I mean, if the transition is working or not, in terms of the soil health and in different kind of parameters, right? So they are using open hardware tools to co-developed with the farmers to try to understand how their transition is working.
Which again is, I think, really important, because in some things you need precise science, and in other things, like when you're looking at soil science, if you have the technology to just do your own testing, as opposed to going to a lab, and you can do it in a way that's, you know, relatively accurate, then that's an advantage for a small farmer. And you know, the measurement goes on in terms of carbon, water use, all the things that we talk about, even down to zero hunger, right? How we deal with food waste. And so there's so many applications. So one of the things that I would say, I think my husband said that too, that there's a role here in the open science for how you roll it out to the practical. Not only the manufacturing, the building, but also the government, the policy, the practitioners who are actually out in, say, mobility, energy, and agriculture, if you want to take those as the three main systems, but trying to do that innovation. And what interests me about open source is that it helps us make that leap. In some ways, business is slow to move, government even slower, but open hardware allows us to maybe make some of the changes that we need to make in very rapid order towards, sustainability and all the other, goals that we want to achieve. So I look at it as a platform that's going to accelerate and, as you said, disruption, but will also accelerate the changes we want to see.
That's interesting. That would be like an H2 plus in this exercise, no? How open hardware works for the scenario we want and not for the bad one.
And I think I'll just add one more point. I think that there's again something to be harnessed by the everyday, ordinary citizen. People are like, it's why hackathons and everything has been, people have adopted it, and why people innovate in their own work every day. So I think it's bringing that community together in a platform and using resources. Some of your examples, again, using technology in the pandemic locally. One of my other banners is local. So anyways, I'll finish there. And I don't know, you maybe have something else to say.
Useful, I don't know how familiar you are with the open source software world, but a useful comparison would be some of the large open source projects. One of the biggest would be the Linux operating system. It began as an open source project at the smallest level, but it now involves literally thousands of software developers. And it's interesting from a couple perspectives. One is an operating system is amongst the most complex things that humans have ever produced. And that complexity involves hundreds of different specialties. And so it's difficult for any one person to wrap their arms around that kind of level of complexity. And so you can democratize that whole exercise by involving more and more people. Of course, there are companies, a good example is Microsoft and Apple. They've created their own operating systems, but it would be difficult for any one company to come along and create their own operating system and make it a game changer around the world. Linux did that sort of in an organic fashion by starting small, adding complexity in layers, involving different disciplines. It's also interesting from another perspective. Because it is so complex, if you came in off the street and wanted to become involved in developing that further, that operating system, you could legitimately do that, but they wouldn't let you tackle the most complicated parts right off the bat. You would have to work your way up, and that involves acquiring skills and showing that the work that you produce is of a sufficient quality that they could accept it into the software product going forward. Another perspective on that exercise is because it involves very specialized expertise, it involves a tremendous amount of labor, and which is difficult to come by if you don't pay somebody to do it. There are hundreds of corporations that second their employees to that project. And so you find people on the list of contributors for the Linux operating system from companies like Microsoft and IBM and on down the list. And so one of the things you might strive for is to partner with industry leaders in a particular domain to try to fill in gaps or to help make the project viable in a longer term.
Absolutely agree.
So can I?
Yeah.
So you have something to add, or I just
No,
want to
I was-
react to the whole.
I was just going to say, we've talked a lot, so I'd love to hear from other people as well.
But yeah, so Carlos left a really good comment, and I think it ties up well with what Karen you said last. He said, I'm going to read it from the chat. I was thinking maybe the value of an open hardware process with people that are not experts is not just the final product, but the process itself and the meaning that it can take for the participant. So this for me, I think it ties very well with what you were talking about, and I was also thinking about both the community aspect of these collaborative developments and the local aspect of these developments. And I think these are two very key things that I'm really happy that they showed up in ways that maybe, and then a final aspect that is also very related to what Carlos wrote is the learning aspect, which Tech Guy has been just mentioned, about people engaging in less complex tasks and building up their expertise through participation in the community. So these are things that, I mean, while we've been in the GOSH community, we do approach in several different ways, and even like more broadly the open hardware community or open science community. It's true that these are things that maybe the policy briefs don't directly deal with. Maybe they do in one or two things, but might be further explored. So there's this triptych, let's say, of community, local, and learning. And I'm trying to summarize a little bit.
Yeah.
Sorry?
No, sorry. I was just thinking of, can we imagine, given what's your name, Tech Guy? I don't want to say Tech Guy.
Yeah.
Rich Miller.
Rich, okay. So Rich, you were saying, you were mentioning the different kinds of expertise and the professionalization kind of need and quality. I'm trying to see if we can imagine instances where that expertise, those expertises can come together. Because as Ali mentioned, we all love Linux, but hardware has kind of different material realities, right? So I don't know, can we imagine, for example, an instance of someone having a great idea and prototyping that idea with Arduino or whatever easy thing to prototype, but then connecting to someone else who can pick that up and turn it into a professional product? Yeah,
no, I think that's the key to taking that step. You know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, if you were creating something strictly that was software based, all you need is a laptop and a bunch of software, and you can create away. But for something physical, it becomes infinitely more complicated, and it requires an awful lot more disciplines. But if you can collaborate with another individual or another group of individuals or a company or a combination of all of those, then you might be able to solve that. You know, if you're a manufacturing company, manufacturing companies, they don't make absolutely everything that they use to create their product. A car manufacturer, for example, they have thousands of suppliers that create components and they assemble the car. Something simpler, there's a lot of intellectual property for a particular item, but they buy maybe the majority of the components off the shelf from other suppliers. So that model is something that you might want to keep in mind, is that there's an advantage to leveraging standardized components and then making the very specific design features that come from your open source collaboration, the part that is truly available. Sorry, that's something, Ali?
Yeah, no, great. That's great. That's great. And I just want also to welcome Andrea, who just joined us.
Oh.
Andrea, hi.
Hi.
Just so maybe Andrea, just to give you some context. This is Andrea disappeared, so no worries.
No worries.
So yeah. let me go back to.
Okay.
So yeah, I think what was I going to say? Yeah, so specialization, open suppliers.
About using parts from other suppliers.
Yeah, so I think one thing, I think there's two, because I keep thinking there's a set of solutions that people in the open science hardware movement, or maybe more broadly open hardware movement, have been like social solutions, and that's coming back a little bit to Carlos's comment, and because if this complexity and this both cognitive and material complexity, the combination of cognitive and material complexity in open hardware kind of keeps pushing, keeps asking this question about how you're going to do this. Not only how do you get to the final product, and how do you make this how be as generative as possible of more of what you need to keep doing it. And I keep thinking of, like I said in the beginning, I'm a bit involved in the hackerspace community. So this is a kind of when I think of this combination of how do you get the communities, local and learning together in a way that is self-promoting, and sustainable. I think this comes back to another thing I keep thinking about. I think we need a different kind of to do open science hardware properly. We might need a different kind of institution that is somehow resembles what happens in a hackerspace, where communities get together to tackle mostly local, because you're physically in a place, issues and learn how to do open hardware stuff, but geared towards.
There's the glue missing, no? There is something there that I feel there's
an institution, a form of institutionalization that is missing, like the university was for academic, for knowledge.
Because also hacker spaces are having problems for sustaining their activity. I was part of a hack lab. It's really difficult to sustain a community space. You have to generate some sustainability strategy. People work on other things and do that on their free time. So I think more in terms of how do you connect that.
And the one contradiction, sorry, you're in the middle of a phrase, sorry.
No, I interrupted you, please go ahead.
I mean, one contradiction is that hackerspaces grow easily where people already have more access to stuff. to knowledge, to parts, to money, and if we're talking about open inequalities of access, and that can change also, like Carlos said, like the way people relate to this process of knowledge building, and like Karen said, like, can you solve your local problems? Like, can you do local science that is not going to be done by universities, science that is not going to be done by corporations, because it's like your garden. You need to understand, well, you want to understand the specific ecosystem of your small scale farm, and it's not something that you're going to package or that's going to come up from a big corporation, or maybe from a university, but not so likely. Go ahead, Julieta.
No, in that aspect, I think it's related to what we have on screen now. That is, open hardware it's an artifact that people use for different things, very, very different things. And some of them are more aligned with this democratic view of everyone can contribute to science, and some of them are not. And I'm thinking diversity.
H2 plus and H2 minus.
And diversity is a key factor there, because I was, as I said in the presentation, Ghosh is very intentional about building a diverse base in open hardware. And it's very interesting because you kind of go into a technical field and you find people from every background, every country, lots of women, which is not very normal in other tech fields, right? But I still think there is like this local generative, very active field of people doing prototypes, and still there is an opportunity for collaboration there. Even if you are in a hackerspace and you want to do research on something that you only care about, I think it is still an opportunity for engaging someone at your local university that is not very happy with what they're doing, and that could enrich your research project a lot. At least in this transition towards something else that I don't know what it is, in which someone comes up with a research idea, prototypes it, sends an email to a server somewhere, and a professional designer comes up with a product. Now that would be like ideal world. I don't know. One ideal possibility. I don't know.
I think one concept from STS that might be interesting here is what are the intermediations that are there might be important in this process. Like I think intermediation is kind of something that people have been talking about. Who are the intermediaries? What are the, not necessarily people, but what are the
gatekeepers?
The agents that are going to intermediate the construction of new arrangements, of new assemblies.
So another way to look at this might be, Julieta, at the beginning you gave some examples of some open source hardware, and one of them was the GPS device that's used in the Amazon. The components. So if you look at that project as maybe an example, the components that make that device are they are probably standardized components, or ones that can be easily sourced from a variety of different vendors, or
imported from China, but quite easily imported.
Yeah, or you can modify even something like an Arduino or a Pi or something that could be re-engineered to do something. But you mentioned the need to make it environmentally strong enough to work in the Amazon in a harsh environment. Well, I can imagine all kinds of other scenarios. If you wanted to use that same device to go underwater, or you wanted to send it up into space for some reason, and those become those forks that you mentioned. You know, a local user wants to adapt that same design to work in a different environment. You know, it suddenly needs to work in the Sahara Desert. A completely different, harsh environment, a lot of dust, a lot of heat, completely dry compared to the Amazon. And so those become local levels of expertise that go into that. But the components that make that device are somewhat standardized. So your suppliers, your design, you can create a repository for all of that type of information, but then the rest of your specialization of the design or innovation can take place at a local level.
And that's tied to what Carlos is saying and Ali was mentioning of intermediates. For me, one key role here is organizations standardizing components, right? Or whatever social infrastructure is in place to standardize those components. I know there are some efforts in the community to work towards that. But it's still a very heavy duty because, for example, some of the software that is used is proprietary, like Autodesk or, so how do you know, there is like some bottleneck there, but I know there are some efforts on that aspect. I don't know, Ale, if you want to say anything about that.
First, I'd like to say that that Gosh has a quite active forum where we discuss these things and on different subjects, different levels, and where we organize our regular meetings and discussions, including the kind of used to be yearly, but now with the pandemic, I don't know exactly how it's going to proceed, but we're going to have a Gosh meeting this year too. And we created a blog post, a forum post. If you want to get in touch or keep in touch or make sure you remember how to get in touch with you. Or if you want to go and see the documents we showed in the presentation in more detail later. I just shared the link to the forum post. And
that's good because people just told me that we need to wrap up in 5 minutes. So I left there the slide with the contacts.
Good.
But
and what else? No, I think I'm quite happy with our discussion today.
Yeah, me too. It's interesting to hear from someone. I mean, your combination is very interesting.
And I think also there's the living labs. You know, a lot of people are presenting at the conference, or I saw one presentation yesterday where people are doing labs at universities and institutions, and that might be a way. And another way might be to take what Rich was talking about, where you adapt to local conditions. That might be a pilot. You know, you take apart components of the project and then customize them, and that might give you a pathway on how to, you know, build the organization's infrastructure to do these things. Like if you take that GPS example, you know, you can pull out components and develop them in open source, and then you can also locally adapt them. So that might be a really interesting project to sort of pilot new organizations to do this.
That's very interesting because that would also be an interesting way of communicating what open source can do in hardware.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it also gives everybody a local application. So it's of interest to many people around the world in many different communities. And then the final point that I would make is the power of institutions in municipalities, like libraries, and I mean, I'm not knowledgeable around the world, the equivalent, but there are public institutions that are, you know, like in Canada, for example, a number of years ago, they started putting 3D printers into libraries and making these hacker spaces.
Yeah.
So I think that there's, where possible, you know, there's opportunities to develop those through existing institutions or existing organizations in countries that may not have those opportunities. For, yeah,
That sounds
that's a
great.
possibility.
Thank you. Ale, do you want to close with a reflection before we go?
Yeah, I think we have to think I think I'm liking more this three horizons thing, because I think we really have to pay attention to the risks that disruptions do not end up not addressing inequalities. And the fact that the policy work is really tied to the fact that infrastructure and investment and intentional policy seem critical to open hardware, to maybe provide this intermediations so that, you know, local communities, hardware hacker spaces can become these places of interconnection with other sources of knowledge, of supplies, of this might lead to a reproduction of inequalities, because like you said, in Canada, in France, you have a lot of money for maker spaces and hacker spaces, and there's a risk that this doesn't translate well to poorer countries where we'd like. I mean, there's two levels of inequalities. There's an inequality between an inequality of access to science, which exists in rich countries as well, between the general public and the academics and industrial people. So I think this solves. I mean, there are policies, this institutionalization will more easily solve this issue. And I think there's pathways that we're seeing in more developed countries where, yeah, eventually maybe they need to be further developed, but it may happen. It's possible to see how this happens in a country like Canada. People, like, even I was with a friend of mine who's working in a fab lab, and it's like schools now have fab labs, and they do like prototyping and things like that with the students. And while in other places, so this bridges an inequality gap, but between people that are in countries that are already more developed, and this might widen the gap with countries that aren't and that don't provide this.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point to try to address, like intentionally going south to try to build from there.
That's one of, I think, the good things about GOSH, and one of the things that made me also want to join this community, is that it's that there's this very insistent point on inclusion and making sure that this is not about academics in rich northern institutions exchanging designs between, I mean,
it is about that also. It is about that also.
Exactly. No, definitely. But that not only they profit from that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And
I think that, oh, sorry. I think that there's also a role for trying to get somebody like a large foundation or something, or Red Cross, to do, like, what if you started with, and this may be a really north view, but what if you started with like providing some things like that library in Canada as in refugee camps?
There is that's a great idea, and I know that GOSH, the African chapter of GOSH, has a project that is being taken up by a refugee camp organization to to produce incubators that allow people to produce yogurt to commercialize and eat. So those for me are the most interesting projects, honestly. But yeah, there is a challenge on how do we keep those alive when they are not as spark and shiny and everything as the other ones, no?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but we have to wrap, and I don't want Pip to kill me. But that was wonderful. Thank you so much for
thank you,
joining.
Pete, for helping us as well.
Thank you, Pip, for helping.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Carlos, for your
You're very
comments.
welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. Thank you,
Thank you for your
Karen.
presentation.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.
And
Very
feel free
interesting.
to drop us a message in those channels whenever you want.
Okay.
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 Have a good day.
Yeah.
Bye,
Thanks.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening.